JFK Airport in New York was as hectic as ever. Businesspeople rushed through the terminals. Exhausted parents tried to keep up with their children, and travelers shuffled impatiently in the long security lines. Among them, standing quietly in the first-class boarding line, was a man who looked completely out of place. His name was Ethan Carter. Dressed in a plain black hoodie, slightly worn jeans, and a pair of sneakers that had clearly seen better days, he carried a simple backpack slung over one shoulder. No designer brands, no expensive luggage, nothing about him screamed, wealthy traveler. But there was something different, an air of quiet confidence that set him apart. Standing a few places behind him in line was Daniel Foster, a man who definitely looked like he belonged in first class. Daniel was a well-known venture capitalist, famous for turning small businesses into multi-million-dollar companies. Everything about him, from his tailored navy blue suit to his gold watch and sleek leather briefcase, screamed success and power. As the line slowly moved forward, Daniel's sharp eyes landed on Ethan. He furrowed his brows, scanning him from head to toe. Unable to hide his skepticism, Daniel leaned slightly to the side and muttered to himself, though just loud enough for Ethan to hear. Did they start handing out first-class tickets in cereal boxes or something? Ethan turned his head slightly and met Daniel's gaze. His face remained unreadable, his eyes calm and steady. After a brief pause, he responded, "You'd be surprised where people end up these days." Daniel expected a reaction, maybe embarrassment, maybe defensiveness, but Ethan remained unfazed, and that irritated him. Determined to get a response, Daniel smirked and added, "I'm just saying, first class usually has a certain standard." Ethan shrugged. Maybe the standard isn't about what you wear, but how you carry yourself. Daniel let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Right, let's see how this plays out. The boarding announcement interrupted their conversation, calling first-class passengers to board. Daniel sighed in relief. At least he wouldn't have to deal with this guy for the whole flight. But life had other plans. As he reached his row, his seat was right next to Ethan's. Daniel stared at his ticket, then at Ethan, then back at his ticket. "You have got to be kidding me." Ethan, noticing Daniel's reaction, gave him a knowing smile. "Small world, huh?" Daniel sighed dramatically before plopping down into his seat. "Great, this should be interesting." The plane ascended smoothly, leaving New York behind as it soared through the sky. Inside the first-class cabin, a hushed elegance filled the air, plush seats, soft lighting, and an exclusive atmosphere that only a few could afford. Daniel, now settled into his seat, was still trying to process the fact that he was stuck sitting next to Ethan Carter for the next several hours. Out of sheer curiosity, he turned his head slightly, watching as Ethan casually pulled a worn-out paperback book from his backpack and began reading. Daniel scoffed under his breath. A book? Really? First class was meant for business moguls, industry leaders, and people of significance, not some random guy reading a beat-up book like he was lounging in a public library. Unable to hold back his irritation, Daniel leaned in slightly, his voice dripping with amusement. "So, tell me, how exactly did you end up in first class? Lost ticket? Charity giveaway? Or did someone owe you a favor?" Ethan turned a page in his book before glancing at Daniel. His expression remained unreadable. "None of the above." Daniel chuckled. "Come on, I'm just curious. You don't exactly scream, first-class traveler." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And what does a first-class traveler look like?" Daniel smirked, gesturing toward himself, like someone who actually belongs here. Ethan exhaled softly, shaking his head as he returned to his book. Interesting perspective. Daniel wasn't done. He thrived on confrontation, and he was determined to get under Ethan's skin. "I mean, no offense, but this isn't economy. People here have a certain status. You can't just walk in wearing thrift store clothes and expect to fit in." Ethan finally closed his book and looked directly at Daniel. "Fitting in has never really been a priority for me." Daniel let out a dramatic laugh. "Well, that much is obvious." A flight attendant approached with a polite smile. "Gentlemen, can I offer you something to drink?" Daniel turned to her, flashing his most charming, self-important smile. "Yes, I'll take a glass of your finest champagne. After all, what's first class without a little luxury?" The flight attendant nodded before turning to Ethan. "And for you, sir?" Ethan gave a small smile. "Just water, please." Daniel nearly choked on his own laughter. Water? In first class? Seriously? Ethan accepted the bottle from the flight attendant without hesitation. Yeah, I'm fine with this. Daniel shook his head in disbelief. You know, I respect people who try to stay humble or whatever. But at some point, you have to admit when you're out of your league. Ethan took a slow sip of his water before responding. And at some point, you have to realize that wealth doesn't equal character. Daniel's smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. That's a nice little fortune cookie line. But let's be real, there are levels to life. And some people simply don't belong at the top. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He just studied Daniel, his calm gaze meeting the other man's sharp, arrogant eyes. Then, he simply smiled. And for some reason, that smile unsettled Daniel more than any argument ever could. The tension in the air was thick. Daniel, still holding his champagne glass, stared at Ethan with a mix of amusement and irritation. Every response from this guy felt like a calculated refusal to acknowledge reality, a reality in which Daniel was superior. And Ethan was out of place. Daniel leaned back into his seat, swirling his drink casually. You know, I've seen people like you before. Ethan, still calm, raised an eyebrow. Oh? Daniel smirked. Yeah, the type that talks about character and simplicity because they don't have much else to show for themselves. It's easy to say money doesn't matter when you don't have any. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took another sip of his water before finally saying, and it's easy to say money is everything when it's the only thing you have. For the first time, Daniel's smirk faltered. A few passengers nearby had started to subtly listen in. The way Ethan spoke, so calm, so precise, made it feel like every word had weight. Daniel's fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. He hated feeling like he was losing a conversation, especially to someone who didn't even seem to be trying. Deciding to reclaim the upper hand, Daniel exhaled dramatically and said, Look, I get it, you probably work hard, probably have your little business or whatever. But there's a reason people like me sit in first class all the time. And people like you just get lucky once in a while. Ethan didn't react, he just tilted his head slightly, as if he was waiting for Daniel to dig himself deeper. Daniel smirked, taking another sip of champagne before delivering his final strike. The truth is, some people just aren't meant to sit at the top. And that's when it happened. A flight attendant suddenly approached Ethan with a bright, professional smile. Mr. Carter, the captain wanted me to let you know that your private jet in London is ready for you upon arrival. He also sends his best regards. Silence. Daniel blinked. His champagne glass froze mid-air. A few passengers who had been eavesdropping turned their heads sharply. The words echoed in Daniel's mind. Mr. Carter. Private jet. Wait, no, that couldn't be right. He laughed awkwardly, setting his glass down. Hold on, Carter? As in, Carter Technologies? Ethan gave a small, polite nod. That's right. Daniel's entire demeanor shifted. He suddenly felt cold. His entire career revolved around networking, power, and influence. And here he was, mocking the CEO of one of the biggest tech firms in the world. Daniel had just spent the last hour treating a billionaire like he was an intruder in first class. Passengers nearby exchanged knowing glances. A few even let out amused chuckles. Daniel swallowed hard. His arrogance, his confidence, it all crumbled in an instant. The weight of the moment was suffocating. Daniel, who just moments ago had been full of arrogance and superiority, now felt like a fool sitting in his designer suit, drowning in his own words. The murmurs of nearby passengers, the smirks on their faces, it was all too much. He had spent the entire flight mocking a man who owned a private jet. A man who could probably buy the entire airline if he wanted to. The realization hit him like a truck. His throat felt dry, and for the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. Ethan, on the other hand, remained calm. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't throw any of Daniel's words back at him. Instead, he simply leaned back into his seat and took another sip of water, completely unfazed. Daniel clenched his fists, struggling to maintain his composure. Then, in a moment of rare humility, he cleared his throat and muttered, Look, He hesitated. The words felt foreign in his mouth. Apologizing wasn't something he was used to. But the way Ethan was looking at him, calm, expectant, yet giving him the space to figure it out, made him realize he couldn't just brush this off. Daniel let out a long sigh. Dropping his arrogant facade. I was out of line. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Waiting. Daniel swallowed his pride. I judged you before I even knew you. I assumed things because of how you looked. And I acted like an ass. Ethan studied him for a moment before nodding. Yeah, you did. Daniel let out a dry chuckle. You're not going to let me off easy. Huh? Ethan shrugged. Would you, if the roles were reversed? Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Exhaling. Probably not. There was a beat of silence before Ethan finally spoke. I appreciate the apology. But more than that, I hope you actually take something from this. Daniel frowned slightly. Like what? Ethan smiled, just slightly. That the measure of a person isn't their wealth, their seat in first class, or the brand of their watch. It's how they treat people when they think no one is watching. Daniel let those words sink in. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about his net worth, his business, or his next big deal. He was thinking about himself. As the flight began its descent, Daniel found himself staring out the window, lost in thought. When they landed, Ethan stood up, retrieving his simple backpack as if nothing had happened. Daniel hesitated for a moment before finally saying, Ethan. Ethan turned back to him. Daniel extended a hand. It was interesting flying with you. Ethan considered the handshake before taking it, his grip firm but not overpowering. Take care, Daniel. And with that, he walked away. Daniel remained in his seat, watching as Ethan effortlessly blended into the crowd. No entourage, no flashing cameras, no need for special treatment. Yet somehow, he carried himself with more power than any billionaire Daniel had ever met. And for the first time in his life, Daniel realized, maybe true success wasn't about how many people admired you. Maybe it was about how many people respected you.